This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit Shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Hey, baseball fans. Welcome to Rounders, your baseball history podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Lambert. Get ready to step into the time machine with us, and we're not just talking stats and scores. We're digging into the heart and soul of the players, teams, and countries that have made this a global sport. From the underdog stories to those jaw-dropping moments, Rounders is your front seat to the epic journey of baseball. So grab a seat in the digital bleachers, relax, and let's swing for the fences together. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Rounders. I am your host, Jeff Lambert. I'm excited. Today, we're going to be unveiling a new series in our show, just like the ones we do for team autopsies or baseball innovations or fact versus fiction. We're starting a new particular series that's going to be looking at baseball's travel abroad, and we are calling it, appropriately, I think, Baseball Abroad. So, a couple things we're going to look at in each episode. When we do these, we're going to look at how the sport arrived in countries around the globe. We're going to look at how it grew in popularity. We're going to look at famous players representing national pride and where the game we love stands today in terms of national interest and dominance. So to kick off this series, we are going to be traveling to Australia to examine baseball's origins down under. This is going to be the first of 2 episodes on this. I decided to split it in 2 because it's such an interesting topic. I thought it would be good to give you 2 different bite-sized pieces. Let me know what you think about that approach to having, I guess, shorter episodes covering a topic, or if you prefer the longer ones, and we'll adjust accordingly. I appreciate the feedback as it comes in. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Baseball Abroad, Australia. The popular narrative is that baseball was believed to have been brought to Australia with American gold miners who came for the Victorian gold rush in the 1850s. And the story goes that, well, these miners would play baseball on the gold fields on their rest days from working in the mines. And we based that around the fact that there were reports of organized teams and results that started to appear in local newspapers in Ballarat, Victoria, around 1857, right before the Civil War. So that's the popular line that, okay, that's how baseball came to Australia. But there are some differing opinions on this. One of them comes from John Thorne, who's the official historian for Major League Baseball. So he states that those Ballarat tales are preceded 2 years earlier by a article that was in a newspaper called the Colonial Times that dates back to 1855. So here's the quote. It said, "Sabbath desecration. A correspondent requests us to call attention to the practice of a number of boys and young men who congregate in Mr. Wilkinson's paddock on Sunday afternoons for playing at cricket, baseball, and making a great noise and offending the eyes and ears of persons of moral and religious feeling," end quote. So we see that 2 years earlier, before there were miners from America even working in the mines near Ballarat, we see that there was a mention of kids playing baseball and causing a disruption. So this is an interesting aside, because where this newspaper article came from is not even close to Ballarat, where we usually believe that baseball started in Australia. Ballarat is in the far south part of the country near Melbourne, and Hobart, where this newspaper article came from, is on the northern coast of the island that has been known as Tasmania since 1856. So what does this recent discovery tell us, these 2 accounts 2 years apart? Well, baseball probably did come with American miners that traveled to Australia, but there were other Americans from other walks of life who brought the sport over to the country and popularized it too. The Victorian Gold Rush is responsible for a lot of Americans going to the country. I mean, that is without a doubt. In fact, a census shows that over 2,900 U.S. natives were living in Australia by 1854. And these were businessmen, these were cooks, they were even escaped slaves. So they played the sport and they grew it in Australia. There's several accounts of clubs that started popping up all across the country very quickly as we move forward from this date in the 1850s. So, the city of Sydney reported its first baseball club in 1878. Then you see in St. Kilda, which was a community on the outskirts of Melbourne, they founded a club that would become a leading movement for baseball across the country. And this club is described as Australia's oldest non continuous baseball club. Another example in Surrey, which was a community outside of Sydney, they also founded a baseball club in the 1870s. So, in just 20 short years from the Victorian Gold Rush and even before, we see that baseball is really becoming a popular recreational activity across the country, both casually and competitively, with the founding of these professional clubs. So that is the foundation for baseball. It wasn't just American miners that brought it through, it was an immigration of lots of Americans from lots of different walks of life that came to the country for different reasons, bringing the popularity of the sport with them. It's larger than just the American miners that brought it. So we see professional clubs founded across the country. There was another event that happened that helped baseball grow even more. So, this is where we see in just 20 short years, baseball really taking off in Australia. And America took notice of that. None other than an American entrepreneur we've talked about in previous episodes by the name of Albert Spalding. So, Albert Spalding, we've talked about in previous episodes. He was the guy who was responsible for the invention of batting headgear. He was also the guy that popularized the first baseball cards that were used. He decided in 1888 that trying to help grow the sport overall and, of course, help grow his sales, he decided, I'm going to put together an American professional team and travel to Australia. So in 1888, that was the plan. He wanted to bring the Chicago White Stockings, later the White Sox, and have them play exhibition matches against these teams, these professional baseball clubs that existed already in Australia. So the plan was to bring the Chicago White Stockings during their off season to do this. They also decided to form a second club because this idea took off in popularity very quickly in the United States of going to Australia. So there was another club called the All Americans that was put together, and players from a bunch of other professional United States clubs got together to be able to join the second group that was going to go travel to Australia. And this group of players from other teams outside the White Sox included future Hall of Famers like Cap Anson, John Montgomery Ward, and Ned Hanlon, who's often referred to as the father of modern baseball. So we have these two clubs get on a steamship and decide to go to Australia to play exhibition matches against professional clubs in Australia. One of them, the Chicago White Sox, the other one, this collection of players from other professional U.S. clubs. This journey of going to Australia and playing these games is known as the Spalding World Tour. So in 1888, these teams boarded that steamliner and they headed overseas to promote the sport. Now, the ships arrived in Sydney Harbor on December 14th, 1888. And of course, the ship was draped in red, white, and blue banners. The tour advertising that came before they arrived was incredibly effective, as hundreds of people were waiting on the wharfs to greet these Yankee baseballers. That's literally how the Australian press referred to them, Yankee baseballers, arrive in the city and in the country. So these two teams arrived from the US, and the first match was played the next day in front of 5,500 spectators. And the clubs played two more matches in the city before boarding a train to Melbourne. One standout match that happened as they went to Melbourne to continue their tour was when the White Stockings played a 4 inning game against a squad of Melbourne cricket players, which were known as the Modern Melbourne Baseball Club. 12,000 people showed up to see this match between the popular cricketers and the Chicago White Stockings from the United States. The tour continued throughout the month. On December 22 and 23, we saw the White Stockings play three more matches in front of really excited spectators, and they traveled to other cities like Adelaide and Ballarat for more games. So a month later, at the end, midway through January, we saw the Spalding World Tour make that whirlwind travel across the country, playing different professional clubs. It was a resounding success. The teams boarded a steamship, said goodbye to Australia, and they sailed off into the sunset. Now, a fun note before we move on, that tour that Spalding put together. So Spalding waited until the ship had left the harbor to go back to the United States to tell everybody on board. These are professional baseball players. These are guys that were excited to go to Australia. They're ready to go home. They spent a month in the country. Spalding literally waits until the ship leaves dock and they're out in the ocean. And he informs everybody on the ship that, by the way, we're not going back to the United States. We're going to make stops in Asia, Africa, and Europe before we go back to the US. That was not taken well by several people on board, but it happened regardless. They continued their tour in other countries, and you got to give it to Spalding. He knew how to be able to make things happen, for better or worse, for the people that were on that ship. So Spalding was not shy about radioing back to the United States, about wiring back and letting people know that the trip had been a huge success. And he felt that Australia was going to be instrumental in baseball's growth in other countries. So he decided that he was going to leave his assistant, a guy named Harry Simpson, to stay in Australia and help continue growing the sport. And his goal was, I want you to go and establish more clubs in more cities around the country and start organizing them into leagues so those leagues can then play each other. So Spalding made sure that baseball remained a focus area, at least for him, in growing the sport. And this was instrumental in helping baseball continue to grow across the country. So Harry Simpson was very successful as he stayed. As the world tour departed, he got down to work and said, okay, how can I provide more structure and grow the sport in Australia? So in 1890, just a year after he arrived in the country, he helped found the Victoria Baseball League. In 1891, he helped found another league called the New South Wales Baseball League. So, just in the span of 2 short years, we see his efforts paying off by organizing not just professional clubs, but leagues for those clubs to be able to organize themselves into. Unfortunately, that momentum was cut short because Simpson died that same year in 1891 of typhus. But his efforts are still celebrated and remembered today in Australia. He was actually inducted into the country's Hall of Fame in its inaugural class of 2005. And those two leagues that he helped found just 2 years over, they started to participate in interleague play shortly after. And that connected professional baseball nationwide for the first time. So teams from these two leagues first met when Victoria played South Australia at the Eastern Melbourne Cricket Ground. So baseball's popularity is continuing to grow. We see clubs founded. We see the World Tour take shape and visit. We see leagues founded, and these pro leagues continue to grow. The next step in Australia's evolution for the sport continued in 1897 when Australia formed its first national touring baseball squad. So in 1897, the Victoria Baseball and New South Wales Baseball Leagues decided that they were going get together, and they were going to form the first Australia representative baseball team. And the idea was to copy what Spalding did when he brought players from the US to Australia, and this time take a league or take a team of elite Australian baseball players and go to the United States. And this became known as the Kangaroo Tour. So the club landed in the United States 1897. They toured cities across the US. But unfortunately, the excitement to see Australians play American players did not work as well in the reverse in terms of popularity. The team also struggled to play American pro clubs. They found very little on field success, and they only won 8 of the 26 games that they played in the United States. Now, a highlight from this Kangaroo Tour happened in June 21st of that year. We saw the Australian baseball team play a game in Boston against a group of retired baseball players. The match was heavily advertised, and it was going to feature, in addition to seeing these Australian players play retired greats, there was also going to be the unveiling of a new invention at this game called a mechanical pitching machine. But even with all that hype, only 500 fans showed up to see this game. And in the eighth inning, because the crowds were so small and because the score was so lopsided, it was agreed that they were going to set up the pitching machine and let it take the mound for the Boston club against the Australian baseball club. The first throw out of that mechanical machine was wild, according to a journalist from the Boston Globe. He stated in the article that, quote, "It appeared so suddenly that the batsman ducked. The catcher made a wild leap to one side while the ball sailed directly over the plate and up against the backstop with a resounding crack." So, not a great start for the mechanical machine, but certainly something that was a feature, something that we certainly enjoy today, especially when it comes to baseball practice. And I guess in a motion of goodwill after the game, even with the lopsided score and the poor crowds, the Boston squad, who won very easily, they organized a banquet in the visitors' honor, invited the Australian club, and they broke bread together. So the tour continued on after that, but there was really poor attendance in every city that they went to. And the organizers of the Kangaroo Tour actually ran out of cash midway through. And they were so broke that the Australian players had to wire friends and family back at home to pay for their ship fare to be able to go back to Australia. Let's fast forward to another major event in baseball's growth in Australian history. This happened on New Year's Day in 1914. There was a decision made that two American baseball clubs were going to go back to Australia, just like they did for Spalding's tour in 1888. These two clubs were the New York Giants and the Chicago White Sox. Now, in addition to the players on these teams going, there were other notable players from other teams that made the trip because it was the off season, and they decided to don each team's uniforms to be able to take part. Some of those players that made the trip included future Hall of Famers Buck Weaver, Tris Speaker, and Jim Thorpe. So the White Sox and the Giants arrived in the country. They played an exhibition game on the same day that they landed in Brisbane, Australia. And then in the next two games after that, they traveled to Sydney. And estimates state that they drew crowds of 10,000 people to be able to see these games. They went on to play a fourth game in Melbourne and saw similar results. Fans showing up excited to be able to see this. So after that fourth game, the club sailed back to the United States, but it was undeniable that baseball's popularity in Australia not only had arrived, but it had lasted over several decades. The professional clubs were doing well, there was an interest by the fans, and we see that professional presence continue to grow. So that grassroots support and continued fan interest is going to lead to the next step in the sport's evolution down under. And that was the formation of a national league that fans could call their own. Next week, we're going to look at the league's growth and popularity. We're going to take a look at where the sport is today in Australia. And we're going to profile some of the most famous players from the country to play in Major League Baseball. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to be with you. I hope you tune in for the next episode to hear more about Australia's history and origins for baseball. It's been great being with you. And remember, there are only two seasons, winter and baseball. See you next week. Thanks for joining us for this episode as we explored another amazing moment from baseball history. You can help grow the show by liking us on YouTube and your podcast app of choice. Don't forget to head on over and sign up for the free email newsletter and the bonus show, This Week in Baseball History. Just go to www.rounders.substack.com. A special thanks to our premium subscribers that are helping us grow for just $1.25 a week, and to our starting 9 supporters, Nathan Halverson and Jack Wilson. You are the producers helping make this the top baseball history show out there. See you next week, and remember, there are only two seasons, winter and baseball.